Tuesday, in the studio, Walter Becker and Donald Fagen are going to do it again.
I didn't start out to be a singer, and I ended up being the lead singer of Steely Dan by accident, really, when we just couldn't find someone who could convey the proper attitude that Walter and I envisioned. And, I toured for 2 years with the band as a frontman, but it was too stressful for me. I spent the better part of a decade of my life working on those records and songs, and I'm glad that it's held up, stylistically, and is still appealing to people 10 years later or 20 years later. That I'm glad that it's held up better than some of the clothes I was wearing at that time. Are you reeling in the years? Hi, I'm Walter Becker. Hi, I'm Donald Fagen in the studio for Steely Dan's Can't Buy a Thrill.
There has always been something mysterious about the music of Steely Dan. The music they made was exotic and distant, different somehow from the rest of what was on the radio. Pop music before Steely Dan came along had never been quite this edgy. It had never been quite this cool. What added to the mystery was the fact that Steely Dan was never really a band, not in the traditional sense. Oh, there were musicians, all right, wonderful musicians like Jeff Skunk Baxter and Elliot Randall and Denny Dias. Over the years, though, the musicians would change, but the heart of Steely Dan, the shadowy figures who created it all, remained constant. They continued to weave their strange musical tapestries into some of the most critically acclaimed and popular albums of the 1970s. Their names, Walter Becker and Donald Fagen, and they were the ones who brought Steely Dan to life. They never meant to be pop stars, and in most ways, they never were. They didn't like to tour, they didn't like to pose for photos, and they didn't like to do interviews. To this day, Donald Fagen doesn't really like the sound of his singing voice. To this day, he's uneasy with the notion of being a star.
I didn't start out to be a singer, and I ended up being the lead singer of Steely Dan by accident, really, when we just couldn't find someone who could convey the proper attitude that Walter and I envisioned. And, I toured for 2 years with the band as a frontman, but it was too stressful for me. It was like I just, am basically a composer, and I enjoy playing a lot, but singing is like, to me makes it a job in a way, and because it's not as easy for me to do as to play, and it's not as doesn't flow as easily. So, but lately I've been getting back into it. I take a few lessons, singing lessons from time to time, and maybe I'll start doing some more.
Denny Dias playing the electric sitar. That's Steely Dan's first single, Do It Again, from their debut album, Can't Buy a Thrill, released in the fall of 1972. Walter Becker and Donald Fagen met in the mid-'60s when both were students at Bard College in upstate New York. Becker remembers when he first heard of Donald Fagen.
When I got there, Donald had already been there for 2 years, and he had this band, and he obviously had the good band and all of the gigs that there were for the band on the campus. So I told him that I wanted to play the bass in his band, and he said, well, gee, I've already got a bass player. And that was that. And then at some point subsequent to that, he heard me playing the guitar, and he had 3 guitar players in his band at that time, and none of them were really any good. So we got a new band together, and I was the guitar player, and we started writing shortly after that.
Donald Fagen.
By that time, I had had a couple bands with personnel that dropped in and out, and I was looking for a good guitar player. I heard him practicing in this kind of campus club, and he was, I heard the first thing before I saw Walter, I heard him playing from outside the club, and I thought it was, some kind of authentic blues person, because it was very, just the technique that he was using, and the sound was really great sounding and really authentic sounding. And then I went in this club, and there was this white kid with blonde hair playing the guitar, and a red Epiphone guitar, actually. And the reason he sounded so authentic is he had learned from another kid called Randy California, who had a couple bands in the 60s, and he was a neighbor in Queens, and Randy, in turn, had learned from real blues people because his father had been in blues bands for a long time. So actually, Walter is in some sort of line of authentic blues players, and you know, we immediately got along very well. We had a lot of things in common. We were both jazz fans who had also become interested in blues and rock and roll, and had a similar sense of humor. So you know, we really hit it off right from the beginning.
From Can't Buy a Thrill, that's Steely Dan and Brooklyn, written by a couple of guys that know a little bit about Brooklyn, Walter Becker and Donald Fagen. But that's not Donald Fagen singing the lead vocal. When we come back, we'll find out why, in the beginning, Fagen shied away from the dirty work of being lead vocalist for Steely Dan.
Welcome back to In the Studio. I'm Walter Becker here with Redbeard.
Thanks, Walter. In 1969, Donald Fagen and Walter Becker left Bard College and went to New York to try their hand at being pop songwriters. They worked for a while as backup musicians for Jay and the Americans, and they also met up with a producer named Gary Katz. It was Katz who, in November of 1971, got them jobs in Los Angeles as staff songwriters for ABC Dunhill Records. Walter Becker remembers what that was like.
They gave us a little office, and we were supposed to write songs that some of the other artists on the label could do. And as it turned out, the songs that we wrote, none of them were really very suitable for. They had at that time the Grassroots and Tommy Rowe and Hamilton, Joe Frankenreynolds, and you know, Donald and I weren't very good at writing songs for other people, especially for those people. So we tried to write some songs, you know, that would be of interest to those people, and they weren't. So we decided that we had better just continue along, you know, with what we had in mind, which was doing our own record featuring our own bizarre song.
From Can't Buy a Thrill, that's called Kings, with the guitar solo by Elliot Randall. What originally had drawn Becker and Fagen together was their shared love for jazz, and certainly jazz influences were a big part of the Steely Dan sound. The obvious question is, why didn't they become jazz musicians themselves? Why did they turn towards pop? Walter Becker has the answer.
Jazz had kind of dead-ended in a kind of modal improvisation style that was not really that interesting to me or to Donald. And in fact, most of the fire and creative energy that had once been invested in jazz music was now in pop music, and pop music seemed like the direction to go into both of us. So we were aware of the fact that although, you know, jazz was a wonderful kind of music, it wasn't necessarily of any interest to anybody else at that time. So the things that we tried to do were primarily, you know, influenced by blues and the pop music scene in general as it existed at that time.
With Gary Katz lobbying heavily in their behalf, the executives at ABC Records finally decided to let Walter Becker and Donald Fagen record their own songs, material that had been considered too strange for more mainstream artists. And if the music was unusual by pop standards, so was the name that Becker and Fagen chose for their band. Walter Becker tells us the origin of the name Steely Dan.
The name was kind of borrowed from a dildo that was in the book Naked Lunch by William Burroughs, and we were stuck for a name, and we had used this particular name before in a song that we had written a long time before. And now we had, you know, we had a steel guitar player in the band, and it seemed like a good name to us at the time. And in fact, it turned out, you know, it had a certain zing to it, and helped the band be popular in the beginning, I think.
Midnight Cruiser, with the lead vocal by drummer Jim Hodder. There were a number of lead vocalists on Can't Buy a Thrill, including David Palmer, who was brought in halfway through the sessions to sing the songs Brooklyn and Dirty Work. The reason was because Donald Fagen simply didn't feel comfortable as lead singer. I asked Donald how the band felt about his insistence that other people sing some of the songs.
Well, I think they had a conflict about it. On one hand, because Walter and I wrote them and knew what they were about and understood the attitude that was best to convey them, they realized that I could do that. On the other hand, I didn't have had a very small range and really hardly any experience, and they sort of looked at it two ways. On one hand, they wanted somebody with a bigger voice, you know, who could kind of thrilling rock and roll vocalist. But on the other hand, I think everyone knew that we just weren't going to find anybody who could convey the attitude, which was really the most important thing. So they you know, wanted me to do it, and there was some pressure. And finally, you know, after Dave Palmer did a few tracks, which he did quite well, it wasn't really representative of what the thing was all about. So finally, Dave left, and I was elected, really.
By the end of their first tour, before the second album started, David Palmer was gone, and Donald Fagen, like it or not, was the voice of Steely Dan. Here's Walter Becker.
David Palmer left, I guess now it can be told. It was obvious at the time to us that the real sound of the band was Donald's vocals. And moreover, David's live performance style was kind of at odds with the what we were trying to project, you know, as a musical entity. And so there was just a amicable parting of the ways at that point. You know, it had been kind of an afterthought that David joined the band for purposes, mainly for purposes of live performance, and it just didn't really pan out that well.
We'll hear why Steely Dan stopped touring and became strictly a studio band.
Welcome back in the studio. I'm Donald Fagen of Steely Dan.
And I'm Redbeard. Although Can't Buy a Thrill was released in late 1972, the first single, Do It Again, didn't hit the charts until February of 1973. But it went higher than anyone could have guessed, going all the way to number 6. Considering that most people had considered his songs extremely uncommercial, I asked Donald Fagen if he was surprised at the extent of Steely Dan's mainstream success right out of the chute.
We were very, very arrogant teenagers. Well, we were in our 20s, but we're basically teenagers. And we always felt that we would, one of our things would hit. We were extremely confident, and although we, you know, it was very exciting, I think we probably downplayed it among ourselves in a way, because for one thing, we figured, you know, it would be just a one-hit deal. And it was, so we sort of said, well, it's a hit, but a lot of people have these one-hit records, and so what? And there was also something frightening about, you know, becoming known.
A fine one. That's Fire in the Hole from Steely Dan's Can't Buy a Thrill. The album soon went gold, peaking at number 17 in the charts. Steely Dan's first was a hit, and that was something that made Donald Fagen a little uncomfortable.
You know, beforehand we were just kind of we were having a lot of fun playing, and all of a sudden there's all this pressure, and you start rehearsing more and trying to make it really tight, and you know, it was kind of, there's a lot of pressure on me too, because, you know, all of a sudden I realized that, well, there's the sort of a point of no return where now I'm the lead singer of a rock and roll band, and is this really what I want to do? It was, you know, it was both very exciting and also frightening at the same time.
In the years following Can't Buy a Thrill, Becker and Fagen slipped further and further out of the public eye. By 1974, Steely Dan had stopped touring. Becker and Fagen never really fit into the music business machinery, something that Fagen realized even before the first Steely Dan tour.
the whole pop scene had been changing while we were rehearsing this band and making a record, and by 72 or 73, it had really become something unfamiliar to us. There was, at that time, there was a lot of spectacle beginning to start in rock and roll, and you know, we'd end up opening for bands who had very high shoes. A lot of British bands with very high shoes, and also a lot of Texas blues bands and things like that. And we could just see that both the audiences and the music was changing a lot. And I think, for us, having come out of jazz and also the sort of New York Bleecker Street folk scene, folk rock scenes, the whole sort of visual spectacle part of touring was really not something we were that familiar with. And it also seemed, because we used to go see jazz in clubs, and jazz musicians, especially in the 50s, really, although they had their own kind of show business, it wasn't regular show business and didn't have that much spectacle aside from the spectacle of musicians playing and their personalities and so on. And so when all this started happening, because we weren't really that kind of, into that kind of performance, it seemed very strange. And also the audiences started being a different kind of audience than we were used to. We were touring in mid-America and in the South, and people basically wanted to have a party, and we got a lot of Let's Boogie and the whole type. And also we were touring with, originally we were opening for a lot of heavy metal bands and that kind of thing, because those bands always tour, they always need opening acts, so we did a lot of those. And it was very strange, and even though the audiences really liked it, generally speaking, it was a very strange scene after a while. I think we felt alienated from the whole thing soon after we started, really.
Only a fool would say that from Steely Dan's Can't Buy a Thrill. As Becker and Fagan retreated into the safety of their recording studios, Steely Dan's music reached more people than ever. The mystery surrounding its creators seemed only to add to its appeal. Here's Walter Becker.
I spent the better part of a decade of my life working on those records and songs, and I'm glad that it's held up, stylistically, and is still appealing to people 10 years later or 20 years later. That I'm glad that it's held up better than some of the clothes I was wearing at that time, or my haircut, or, So I think that's rewarding, and it's also nice to think that there are enduring values in things, that will make them continue to be of interest, even at a time when the styles are very different, and that it's possible to, tap into those values and make something that will last.
We'll be back in the studio after this.